All right, welcome everybody, and thank you so much for joining our training today on conducting outreach to agricultural workers. My name is Megan Mahoney. I'm the Deputy Director of Framework here at the International Rescue Committee. Framework is a labor trafficking focused training and technical assistance project funded by the Office for Victims of Crime. We work to support starting and seasoned service providers to support them in their efforts to identify and serve labor trafficking survivors. So we offer live events like this. We're also available for individualized training and consultations with your organizations on the topic of labor trafficking. We do peer-to-peer learning exchanges. We create videos and toolkits and all sorts of resources, anything that you can dream up that you think would be helpful to you and your organizations in your anti-labor trafficking efforts. We want you to come to us and we'll partner with you to make things happen. Right now, we're in the middle of a deep dive into labor trafficking outreach. At the end of, or last year, we hosted a series of events on the topic of outreach to labor trafficking survivors, starting with conducting outreach in the context of COVID-19. We hosted two panel discussions, one with survivors and one with seasoned service providers to share their perspectives on outreach, and ended the year with a 2-hour, two-part training and workshop with Legal Aid Society of Metropolitan Family Services in Chicago, really focused on the fundamentals of labor trafficking outreach. So if you missed any of those events and you're interested, check out our resource library. You can see recordings of those events as well as one-page summaries and also a discussion guide on the fundamentals of labor trafficking outreach. Today is exciting because we are launching our sort of mini series on outreach to specific populations. Obviously, today we're looking at agricultural workers. This event is also being recorded, so you can share it with your colleagues and friends and also revisit it if there are any pieces that you missed. So before we dive in, let's just do a quick review of the features of our virtual shared space. Gonzalo, you can go to the next slide. There we go. So all attendees are currently muted. You can switch between phone and computer audio at any time under audio settings. Right now, we invite you to share your name, your agency, and your location in the chat. And that chat function is going to be available throughout the training. You can use it to share insights and additional resources, and also just indicate if there's a particular point that resonates with you. Make sure when you do that, go ahead and select all panelists and attendees. And lastly, if you have a question at any point during the training, go ahead and click on that Q&A button. And if you see a question that's already been submitted that you also want answered, go ahead and upvote it by clicking on the thumbs up sign. And we'll get to as many questions as we can at the end of the training. So now I'm really excited to introduce our speakers. We are so fortunate to have Stephanie and Gonzalo with us today. Stephanie Bratnick is the anti-trafficking manager of the HOPE program at the International Rescue Committee, and Gonzalo Martinez de Veria is the senior program manager at Verite. Both of these folks have a tremendous amount of knowledge and experience to share with us. In particular, I just wanted to highlight that both Stephanie and Gonzalo have worked in various settings across the United States, Stephanie in Maine and in Northern California, and Gonzalo in Western New York, Texas, and Florida. And so one thing that they understand really well is the challenge of this work across an expansive geographic service area, which I know many of you can relate to. The last thing I'll say before turning it over is just a bit of a disclaimer that there's a degree of assumed knowledge around labor trafficking 101. We're only going to be touching very briefly on the agriculture industry itself so that we can dive right in and maximize our time to get into the really practical specifics that will help you connect with workers. So thank you again for your participation today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Gonzalo.
So today's presentation will be broken up into 4 parts. First, we will have a very quick overview of the U.S. agricultural sector and how workers are spread out throughout the map, and more specifically, how the risk of labor trafficking varies from one place to another within the United States. We will then move on to thinking about how the longer lists of checklists and red flags that we all are familiar with for human trafficking, how they translate into the specific context of US farms, meaning how to understand the signs of trafficking as they show up specifically in agriculture. We will then move on to a more day-to-day practical discussion of how to go from that theory of what we know about labor trafficking risk to building a strategy at a local level around partnerships and outreach when we are looking to target this specific population of farm workers. And as a part of that, we will look at materials that other agencies have used over the years to reach out to this particular workforce.
We cannot talk about unfree labor and forced labor in the agricultural sector in the US now without at least acknowledging that there is a long and complex history of very different forms of unfree labor, including chattel slavery, indentured servitude, and other forms of compelled and forced labor throughout the history of the United States. That could be another entire presentation that we could have, but there is something to be said for taking those legacies into account when we think about power dynamics that are still playing out. These crimes are not happening, and these human rights abuses are not happening in a vacuum. They are partially still happening because of dynamics that started a very long time ago. And we will maybe touch on that throughout the presentation. Of course, the same US government that used to legalize and regulate the formal slave trade is now opposed to all forms of slavery and forced labor in the United States and abroad. And many branches of the US government are working together now to eradicate these issues, including in the agricultural sector. But of course, neither government or civil society has been able to successfully end these forms of abuses anywhere in the economy, including farms. And as a matter of fact, the agricultural sector, if you go by the cases that make their way through the criminal justice system, is one of the top sectors, one of the top settings in which force, fraud, and coercion are used against workers for the purpose of exploiting them. Other top sectors that you may have learned about from Framework and other presentations or materials are domestic work, construction, and restaurants. There have been some major changes that have been going on within the agricultural workforce in the last little while. One of the biggest is the growing popularity of the H-2A farm worker visa program. It actually was the only program that mostly was untouched throughout the pandemic this past year. We've seen the numbers go up year after year, including during the pandemic. And there are many reasons for the growing popularity, but here we bring it up only to say that wherever you are in the United States, it's quite likely that this particular industry of recruiting H-2A workers is reaching your neck of the woods in one way or the other. So it's important for us to understand that within the context of that broader workforce. 2 to 3 million people are making a living on US farms each year, and a growing number of them are using that visa program. That being said, about this workforce really showing up everywhere in the United States, let's keep in mind that workers are not evenly spread out. California has the outsized number of them. Almost a third of the workers in the United States are in California. And there are other pockets in the United States where you really have many more workers than others. And it's not all about numbers. It's not just that the more workers you have, the more risk there is that you have labor trafficking among them. But it really varies depending on which type of crop and what type of labor subcontracting is happening in your state. So from Texas to California to Florida, there would be a huge difference in what the risk looks like. One way you might be able to approximate how things look in your jurisdiction, in your area, is to find that person in the office who is more interested in doing the desk research instead of the outreach, especially if folks are working from home. This is a good time to do that. And go to all the usual places where we find general statistics and data. I mean, the very basic, the very least any agency can do is at least go to the US Agricultural Census and understand if you have seasonal or year-round workforces, go into the wage and hour and OSHA data sets from past 20 years of enforcement and learn which workplaces have been outliers in your community and have been fined and found in violations of basic labor law. And then from there, you could go to other sources like state level agencies or the criminal justice system. One way you could break down those data points is into a chart like what I have in the background here, where you lay out geography across one axis and the type of farming across the other. And you might be able to find out, wow, look, the vast majority of egregious worker rights violations are happening in the apple sector or in the dairy farms. And it's all in the western part of my state and not eastern. Or if you are a national group, you could do something like this map, which actually maps out all of its states against each other. The risk is not evenly spread out. That's what the record shows if you go back and look at it. So it's always worth our time going back and looking at that. So once you've done the desk research, once you've made an educated guess about where the risk might be within your area, you really want to begin to translate these very umbrella general terms that have been published over the years about indicators of labor trafficking and really translate them into the language and the context of your local community. One of the biggest and most encompassing lists of indicators of human trafficking, including labor trafficking, that have ever been published came from the ILO, which in 2012 created a list that they divided into strong and medium indicators of human trafficking. And they really got down to a lot of individual scenarios in that list. And they then updated that in 2018 to make it a little shorter and simpler. But either way, it's always worth our time to take a look at that longer list and check off which indicators, especially the strong indicators, do show up in our local area and why. There might be some here that categorically are not relevant in your community, and you would not want to put that into trainings or into outreach materials, which we are going to cover later on in the presentation. But you might be surprised as to how some of these really broad international indicators do actually show up in the way that businesses operate when it comes to procuring and managing farm labor in the United States. When we had to do that for the 74 counties that a program I was involved with was covering in Texas, these were the indicators out of that much longer list that workers would often name as having been a part of their work experience. So you can see there, for example, that just a little over 10% of workers we connected with in this one study talked about having their documents withheld, talked about facing threats of violence at work. And this was very important information for us to have, that not only was forced fraud and coercion going on in this particular workforce in this particular part of Texas, but that out of that much longer list, these were the experiences that came up the most. By doing that work, we were able to do more effective outreach and better presentations, really digging on these issues and why they come up. You know, why are 20% of workers being coached to lie about working conditions or age? That's really going to vary depending on where you are. So for this next bit, we will start to share the microphone here a little bit and learn from Stephanie.
Thanks, Gonzalo. So I don't think we can talk about outreach without talking about a rights-based approach, which is founded in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is a foundational document. And while it's static on paper, the declaration was not meant to be static. It was meant to be applied. And we see it often applied to the law, But in this approach to outreach, or even to the services that we provide, it's worth discussing, how do we apply the Human Rights Convention to our work? How does it apply to this outreach? And fundamentally, using this approach means that we acknowledge that all the people we serve, all the workers that we're outreaching, are whole, resourceful, intelligent, and should be active participants in any decision or choices for their lives and their community. And that can look like teaming up with worker organizations who are already doing the work of advocacy or outreach, community leaders who know what's happening in their community and what they need. And if you're already doing outreach work with farm workers, you might think about incorporating some basic questions when you're in conversation with them or during events of, what more do you need? What works for your community? Tell us how we can best serve you. And this also goes into thinking more inclusively about workers. Very often there might be an understanding that when we're talking about farm workers, we're talking about male-identified workers. But that's not necessarily the case. There are plenty of women that are working in the fields, and their numbers are growing, and there might be specific needs that they have to share with you, as well as children. There's really not a lot of precise data on the number of minors working in the field, although the Association of Farm Worker Opportunity Programs does estimate that there's about 500 to 800,000 minors under the age of 18 working in the fields. So that's also something to take into consideration, as well as families and family-run farms as well. And Gonzalo is, I believe he's just posted some information on different models of farm worker run organizations and partnering. Gonzalo, do you want to speak to that for a moment?
Hey there, sure. So what I'm actually going to do for the sake of time is in the chat, put a list of agencies that over the years I've had a chance to learn about, that happen to be in some way, some more than others, some in different way than others, led by or very informed by worker input. So if you happen to be lucky enough to live in one of the few places in the United States where there are these active programs, I wouldn't go too far down this road without checking in with them and seeing what their priorities have been or what their current campaigns are. Usually, it's an incredibly fruitful partnership if your goal is to better understand the worst of the worst cases that are happening within that community. It's quite likely that one of these groups that I'll put on the screen here that I'll put in the chat here have not only learned about those particular cases over the years, but may also be looking for a place to send them if they can't handle all the needs that come out of those cases themselves. So I will put that in the chat and kick it back to Stephanie.
Great. So next slide, because we're going to dive deeper into partnering. So step one, right, when you're trying to think about how to begin this work is, what Gonzalo has gone into of research, understanding the landscape of what agriculture work looks like in your organization or in your county, in your area, in your state, in your region. But then step two is doing an audit of who is doing this work already. As Gonzalo mentioned, as we were talking about, identifying those workers or worker organizations or grassroots organizations that are doing the work within the worker context. But I think this is a time to bring the whole team together and do a big brainstorm, brain dump of no idea is too small or too inappropriate of anyone who's doing anything to do with workers. So I've posted some of these on the slide. healthcare organizations. There might be some mobile healthcare units that are going out to the fields that are holding these mobile health events that are working in the camps, perhaps. There might be legal aid that is also going out to the fields to outreach. Certainly mobile consulates are very common, both in where I was working in Maine and also in Northern California. The Mexican consulates regularly did mobile consulate events on weekends. There might be education organizations. I've known of some organizations that specialize in providing GED services to farm workers. They can be great to team up with. Again, grassroots organizations, certainly churches or faith-based organizations where farm workers might congregate. Law enforcement, governmental agencies, the obvious one there being Department of Labor, and certainly farm worker unions if that happens in your state. And then there might also be laundromats where workers go, tiendas or shops where workers frequent. So those are some other things to think about. Now, how do you identify them? If you're on coalition meetings, or you're sitting in on trainings, or you're having, you're listening to some other conversations that might not have anything to do with farm work, but something piques your interest. For instance, I was just on a call yesterday with a team of providers that were not talking about this at all, but someone mentioned that they had previously worked for a Hispanic economic empowerment unit in their agency. And both myself and our farm worker outreach specialists teams afterwards saying, we have to get in touch with them. They could be doing work with farm workers. I'm also a big advocate of talking to anyone or everyone about this, putting it out there, saying, do you know of other agencies that are doing this, or community leaders who are doing this, as well as Google. I mean, the internet is a resource that has tons for us to explore. So just for example, as preparing for this training, I Googled really simply grassroots organization, farm work, California. And the first result that came up was 18 organizations to support during National Farm Worker Awareness Week. And so I might go through that list, pick out who might be working in our area, or even working in the state or the region, and send them a cold email. Next slide, please. Oh, can you go back one slide? Thanks. Okay, so different types of partnerships. You can think about formal partnerships if you have some funds in your organization or within your grant that you want to sub-award to a partner, or an MOU where you're going to formally agree to do outreach together. And what does that outreach look like? And then putting together coalitions or networks. I certainly know in Maine, there was a farm worker resource network that met regularly to support farm workers, and it included everyone from some health clinics, education services, even the Department of Labor was present. And certainly during new partnership meetings, these are three of the key questions that I like to come to the table with. What are our shared goals? What is your mandate? What is my mandate? What are your dreams for this work? What are my dreams for this work? And how can we work together to build our capacity to meet those objectives and those goals? And also then what might be the new opportunities for shared work? For instance, one organization might say, I've always hoped to do a series of farm worker resource sessions at the community church basement, but we don't have the capacity in our staff. Our staff is really maxed. But if you come together in a coalition or even two organizations, you might find that you find the capacity together to do that and to organize that and make it happen. So next slide. So here are a couple of options for outreach. You can design shared material, and the next section will talk more about what makes material impactful. You can share outreach, as I've mentioned before, teaming up. If you have that mobile health unit or those mobile consulates, you might say to the Mexican consulate, can we send a representative to sit in the waiting room during those sessions, set up a table, put out some material, perhaps halfway through during the time when the team breaks for lunch, can I give a small outreach session to the workers that are there? And then of course, group events, workers fairs, or community events. I've seen these happen in gymnasiums, in churches, in community centers, but I've also seen them happen on farms. So you also might find that there are some farm owners that want this information and want more services for the workers who are employed on their farm. In Maine, we held a resource fair for on a dairy farm of a farmer who really wanted to connect their farm workers to more services. And that fair didn't just include folks there to talk about anti-trafficking or worker exploitation. There was an immigration attorney there. There was a NGO that provided low-cost childcare and activities for migrant workers. And then of course, referral pathways is always important to talk about. So workers, as you're doing more and more outreach, will identify different needs. So knowing who in your community provides resources to meet those needs is very important. And then special guest events. So there might be, let's say your local domestic violence agency might be providing sessions to migrant families that are working in agriculture in your area. And perhaps they'll let you come in for one session and lead a training on workers' rights and human trafficking within agriculture. Next slide, please.
So before we dive into this next bit, we'll take a quick pause and put a poll up on the screen to get a temperature check from the audience as to how many of you are already interacting with farm workers in some capacity. So in just one moment here, we'll get the poll. Excellent. Well, there are no wrong answers here, of course. If I had to guess, there might be agencies here with decades of experience already very effectively reaching this population that could be doing the presentation themselves and teaching all of us more about this. And there are others that might just be sort of testing the waters or may not have had the resources recently, to be honest. You know, many agencies want to reach more people than they can with the staff that they have. That's particularly true for agriculture because these are not places that are easy to reach. You usually need somewhat of a gas card to be able to fill up the tank and drive, in some cases, many hours, sometimes staying overnight in different parts of rural areas just to be able to get to a place and start doing outreach in the morning. But with all that in mind, I'm amazed that more than half of you, it looks like, are already finding ways to interact with farm workers. So this next part, and we'll stop the poll here and move on. For this next part, you might be able to compare it to materials you already have, or use it as a resource for creating new materials. Basic questions you'd want to ask yourself before you start drafting are on the screen here. I'll turn it over to Stephanie to talk about this.
Yeah, so again, the most important thing is to know your audience. What languages do they speak, and how do they identify? Which goes back to that initial research as well as working with workers. It's important to talk about language. I think the more simple you can keep the language in the outreach material, the better. You'll see in some of the slides coming up, it might look like a headline of, "You have rights." Are you getting paid for your work? Are you being threatened? You are not a criminal, we can help you. It's really simple, really straight to the point. Visuals are important. Not only do they draw in the audience to read further, but also for those workers who might be pre-literate, it can help even more. It's really important to include resources for help. On our outreach material, we include our number for immediate referrals, but also the National Human Trafficking Hotline, as well as some local resource lines as well. And then multimedia outreach campaigns can also be really useful, such as a radio PSA, which we've started using during COVID to help outreach more isolated workers that were not able to reach because of the pandemic. And also, when we're talking about language, just to go back to that point, to talk about what language do the workers speak in your area. And Gonzalo, this came from your agency, yeah?
Yeah, I think it's hard with ag, right? Because we know the numbers, and we know that over 80% of the workforce might have been, depending on which numbers you're looking at, might be Mexican nationals. Almost all of the rest might be from Central America. And it's easy, I think, for programs to quickly assume that means Spanish will be the one way to go. First of all, as many of you would already know, within that population, you have many people for whom Spanish is not their preferred language and might speak one of dozens of pre-Hispanic indigenous languages that are still quite common in southern Mexico and Central America in particular. So that might be already one language access issue for you. And then the other thing is that, national statistics are national statistics, and they do not necessarily translate fully into every context. So I've been in situations where we get into one town or county where the employer has had a successful program recruiting refugees, for example, from a particular part of the world. And the way that works sometimes is that through word of mouth, they snowball into these particular communities and end up maybe having a primarily Burmese workforce or Sudanese, you name it. South African workers are quite common in the custom combining sector. So all you have to do there is get ready to chat in English across different accents. Well, more complex than that, but it's a different language access issue. So that's all to say, stay on your toes, know your community. That's been a theme throughout, and that applies to designing outreach materials. Stephanie?
Yes, thank you. So this is one of our tools that we use with farm workers. And during the pandemic, because we have not been able to go out into the fields ourselves or into employee-sponsored housing, we have put together PPE kits that include masks, gloves, hand sanitizer, outreach material, as well as material on contratados.org, which is a fantastic organization and tool for farm workers, which I can post a link to in the chat in a second. And then, so in there is this palm card. Again, you can see it's really simple language, clear questions. And then I want to highlight, and it's in Spanish, the majority of the workers we work with in Northern California are Spanish speaking. And you'll see these QR codes. These link one to our farm worker Facebook page. That is a group that is only for migrant farm workers. And it's a place to build community and for farm workers to access more information on services. And then the other one is for our self-assessment screening tool. So if you go to the next slide, there are some screenshots of what that looks like. It's a Google Doc that has 14 yes or no questions in it that will allow us to better understand that worker's situation. They can, at the end of the questionnaire, either they can submit their name and request for someone from our agency to contact them. And we do, regardless of whether their questions meet the human trafficking definition, the federal definition, we will contact them regardless to connect them to services. And if it does seem from their answers that they may qualify as a survivor, we will connect with them for an intake and to gather more information. But it's been really, really useful since we cannot get out in the fields right now to empower workers to assess themselves. Next slide.
Okay, so we've talked about how to create that most effective possible set of outreach materials and messaging campaigns. We've talked about the partnerships you want to cover at the coalition level and at the interagency level. Now we're really getting to the core of one of the key questions in this presentation, which is how to reach the workers in the correct way and how to get that material in people's hand in a way that will be successful. One way to, of course, begin to get closer to an answer to that question in your area is to understand when the workers will actually be in your neck of the woods. So this second poll question is about seasonality. Just based on your experience with this population, would you say that your farm worker community is primarily migrant, traveling seasonally in and out of your state or county? Or are they settled in year round? And as we get that poll up on the screen here, I'll encourage you not to conflate that question with the question of, are the crops seasonal or year round? Because the answer might not be the same. As you might know from research, seasonal follow the crop migrants are not as common as they used to be. So even if you do have a harvest that rotates seasonally and only requires labor for a part of the year, that might be true. And it also might be true that farm workers have settled locally for the entire year and might be doing other forms of work while they wait for the season to pick back up. And I'm not seeing the poll on my screen. I don't know if we might leave that for later, but I'll give it another second. There we go. All right. So yeah, answer this as, which one is more common, if there is one. So I think, unfortunately, the technical answer is yes, technically, most places have both. But which one do you have more of, if you had to guess? Or if it's a real balance, if it's 50-50, then I think both would be the appropriate answer here. Great. So probably getting a lot more of that migrant response from the northern states. And usually in the southern states where climate does allow different forms of crops throughout the year, more frequent for people to be settled in year round. But for those of you that are clicking both, and we can end the poll and move on here, those of you that are clicking both, it might very well be the case that you are in a northern state where the seasonal crops are only requiring labor a part of the year, but you might still have, like Wisconsin and New York, huge dairy farm industries that require manual labor every day of the year. So great to start thinking about that. So once you've sort of identified which workplaces are requiring that labor and hosting them, and you know which type of the year, how do you begin to strategize about the actual place where you will have an interaction between your team and the workers? Stephanie mentioned earlier that there are employers that are open to these types of presentations and outreach, and in many cases would even host an agency like one of yours to have that conversation about legal rights. And we should absolutely take up those leading employers on reaching that audience, because even if in the likely case that an employer like that is not allowing labor trafficking to happen in their farm, you might be reaching a friend of a friend, meaning you connect with a worker at a good farm that knows other people at other farms that are facing indicators of labor trafficking. So we should absolutely take up the open employers on the invitation to get on the farm. But if you think of all the employers in the United States as sort of a bell curve, where you have some that are really proactive about compliance and others that are more middle of the road, the majority probably are middle of the road. Then at the other end of the spectrum, you have the ones that have really allowed a culture of impunity and abuse to take place. And I would challenge us to think that it's probably those specific employers who would never answer your call, who would never allow you on the farm, that are most likely to have that environment where any actor, say a middle manager, could get involved and start forcing workers, coercing workers, deducting pay, getting people into debt bondage, and really engaging in all the things we talk about when we talk about labor trafficking. And it really is going to take additional thought and creativity to be able to reach workers in that setting. We cannot expect an invitation to go there. Of course, safety is always a concern, and that's something that every agency should weigh very carefully. At the end of the day, in some of these situations, it absolutely is not a safe environment for people to be standing around chatting. And unfortunately, there is no one answer for that issue. It really varies from place to place. So how do we begin to get these conversations happening with workers that are in that type of controlling or monitored environment? Well, we would begin by thinking of neutral places where the worker, for that one half hour or afternoon a week, is not right within the eyesight of the manager or employer. Are they going to wire money at the local Western Union? Are they, do they get every Sunday afternoon off to go to Walmart? Or are people getting on and off buses like they do in Yuma down in Arizona every morning? And do they have that half hour to get a coffee with you before they get on the bus and spend the rest of the day at that farm? The key question, if you could just take one thing away from this slide that I would want you to think about, is, have you reached that worker in a way that the worker does not believe that their manager is aware that you are chatting with them? Or even worse, does the worker believe that what you tell them is going to end up being repeated back to the person who might be exploiting them? You have to sort of answer that question in each context, but if you've asked it, you've already put yourself ahead of the curve. So I think we are on time now to begin the Q&A. The last quick thing I'll say, of course, is that I mentioned all these neutral places, but at the top of the slide, you can see that the one place where workers have that neutral, safe, confidential place to chat with you is their housing. Even if it is employer provided housing, in rural areas, the manager is usually not hanging out after dinner time. So if you can reach people on their time off at home, and they, using their tenant rights, decide to have you in their home, give a presentation, that might be the best bet. And I know that's a successful strategy for many agencies. All right, that's it for that. Let's move on.
Thank you so much, Stephanie and Gonzalo. You've provided so much information for all of us to chew on. As folks gather their questions and put them in the Q&A, I just want to toss it back to both of you. I know you just sort of drove home the point, Gonzalo, about the value of connecting with workers in their homes. I just want to give you both an opportunity to circle back or double down or reinforce any of the messages that you've touched on, so that when folks leave this training, they have those really top of mind.
I have one point that I want to drive home, and that the point of outreach for most of us on this call will be increasing identification of survivors. And yet, I think if you lead with that, it'll be very disappointing, because the amount of outreach material and the amount that you need to be talking with folks is so high to start even beginning to get referrals or self-identification. So leading with the idea of we just need to get the information out, get workers trained on their rights and what they're eligible to and how they should be treated is the most important thing, to lead with that, especially knowing you might be working in states with a high level of migrant workers. So folks who are coming in really quickly for harvest season and then moving on to other harvest or planting seasons that are not sticking around long-term, that don't have permanent bases in your area. And for outreaching those folks, it's really about getting the information out as quickly as possible. You know, so for instance, we've passed out this season over 2,000 PPE kits with outreach material, and we've gotten 2 calls from our self-assessment tools, which we take as a great triumph. And I know Gonzalo can definitely speak to the amount of outreach it takes to start getting referrals as well.
Yeah, we did the numbers on Texas, for example. So the ratios are extremely steep. We're talking about a lot of hours, chatting with a lot of people across a very wide geography, just to yield that one call. Then within the calls, and this goes back to Stephanie's earlier point, the majority of people are exploring their rights. They are not ready and may never be ready to take that leap of faith into the many systems that we have ready for them in case they want to reach out. The ratio in my numbers, for example, were that about 1 in 10 workers that came forward about a situation and wanted to discuss them, ultimately, for example, ended up deciding that they wanted to make a referral within the criminal justice system or participate in that system. Now, if you look at the numbers nationally for how few of these cases are actually successfully served, investigated, prosecuted, every one of those is a tremendous victory, that if our systems are coming together and actually serving the needs, I would argue that all that time is worth it just for that one case. But of course, we all have different decisions to make. And if part of your job is convincing your leadership in your agency, I would suggest leading with low expectations about impact by way of numbers, and remembering that we are barely sort of building these systems as we go in many places. And then just to double down on that point of, partnering versus helping, we have to be ready in advance to understand that workers have had a phone in their pocket in most cases, they've had a phone in their pocket. They may even have access to the internet. They may be monitored and controlled, but they certainly have times in which they're not at the farm. And they've chosen in their own risk-benefit analysis not to go running to a service provider asking for an intervention. So we need to bring that assumption into these conversations and be ready for the fact that even if a worker is identifying that all of these indicators of labor trafficking are going on, there might be many good reasons that they have for not wanting to take any action there. I think my definition of success in Texas, for example, was if a worker felt like they could have that conversation with us, and they believed that if and when they wanted to take action, we would be there for them to take that call. And I think that ended up being the most productive way to go forward in that way. Did we want to pick some questions out of the chat here? I don't know if anyone's been scanning them.
Yeah, there have been several questions. One, I'll just piggybacks on the self-identification sort of theme. Stephanie, there's a lot of interest in your self-identification tool online. Folks want to hear a little bit more specifically about any security, privacy, confidentiality concerns or tips for implementation.
Yeah, sure. So, with any outreach material for across any sector that you're providing to someone who you think may currently be trafficked, it's up to, or exploited, it's up to that person to assess whether it's safe for them to take that information and to have it on them. And so that is a potential risk, that if someone is currently being exploited or trafficked, and that that card is found with the QR code and someone clicks on it, or the trafficker or exploiter clicks on it, it is a dead giveaway. There's no way around that. So it is up to the worker whether they feel it is safe for them to take that material and keep it on them. Also, it is digital. So while it's confidential in that the results only go to myself and to our farm worker outreach specialist, and we're the only people that have access to the results and that information, it's digital. So, I suppose, there's a risk of hacking, but there's a lot more also on our computer and our digital systems that if that were to happen, that would be a big issue. For implementation, we have not had to necessarily do anything special to prep workers. It goes in the bag and it gets sent out, and people seem to be adept at navigating that technology. But if there are questions, we're happy to support of like, what does this mean? How does it go? And on our cards, there are specific arrows that point to this of like, scan your phone on this. So there is a brief description of how to use those. I hope that helps around some of the questions.
Thanks, Stephanie. There's another question here, a couple practical questions. One about just like how you find out where employees live and how do you keep staff safe when you visit?
Yeah, so you remember I put that slide on the screen about how much more popular the H-2A guest worker program is. I was part of a group that pushed really hard for the USDOL to convert the way in which they publish information about H-2A orders, which are the documents that employers fill out to get the workers into the United States. And they now more than ever, the information about where each employer provides this required housing that they have to provide is quite accessible. So if you go on the U.S. Department of Labor and you look up disclosure data for H-2A, you'll be able to find not only addresses but also directions as to where the workers are. And then in terms of understanding safety concerns around those questions, that really varies from one place to the other. But the best thing is to just take it one step at a time on your way there. If there are people who know the area before you go in, try to understand that. There's nothing like flagging down a worker and asking usually to really get the best info on that.
Perfect. There is a question about both of your agencies' plans in the new year about conducting outreach in the context of COVID-19. So I want to sort of cue that one up for you. I want to finish on that question that I'm sure is on all of our minds. As you think about that, I want to throw this one out there as well. Gonzalo, just appreciation for that long list of groups that you shared in the chat that folks can partner with. And a question about if you could speak a little bit more about each one to give a sense of their geographic area and topical alignments. So I'm going to post that again in the chat for folks. You had the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, Venceremos, Milk with Dignity, United Farm Workers, Pineros and Campesinos Unidos del Noroeste, how's my Spanish, Farm Labor Organizing Committee, and Fuerza del Valle.
Yeah, I really could take another hour with this one, but I'll put it in this very brief way. If you look at the 2 to 3 million people who make wages on farms, only a fraction of them, unfortunately, just a small number of them, are connected to any of the groups that I mentioned or any group like them, meaning the more than average experience of the average worker where you are is that they are not represented by any union, any worker center, are not members of a worker center. So that's what I really meant it when I said, if you happen to be lucky enough to be in one of the places where these groups even exist, of course, take advantage and connect with them. And you can usually tell by the name where they are. UFW, even in California, has that regional coverage. They do not represent, most workers are not dues paying members of UFW. So you really want to understand whether or not these groups have reached their population. But what's really exciting about these groups that you should take the time to get to know is that many of them are going in the model of the worker-driven social responsibility model, right? So instead of having these top-down solutions that might be imposed on workers by all the powerful actors that are usually involved, whether it's companies or governmental groups, many of these groups are pioneering programs that are being designed by workers. And in some cases, you even have workers training workers on identification and remedies to labor trafficking. So even if they are not active in your area, if you want to look up that worker-driven social responsibility model, maybe there is a local group in your area that wants to try to replicate that, and that might be a successful path for you.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Gonzalo. So in 1 minute or less, guys, how do you approach outreach to farm workers in the context of COVID-19, given a lot of the restrictions that are out there?
I can take a stab at that because we've, while it's been incredibly challenging, we have also been able to come up with really exciting creative solutions that we might not have thought of, and our reach has actually expanded in some ways. So as I mentioned before, those PPE kits, which we hand out to other organizations who are able to go out into the field. So like the Catholic diocese, food banks, grassroots organizations, community leaders. Our radio PSAs will still be running. Facebook group will still be active and recruiting new participants to join that community. We're hoping as things get better in Northern California, we can ease our way back in. So whether that's doing smaller events in the open air, whether we're able to go to, let's say, a farm worker housing camp that's not inside, and setting up some chairs and doing it that way. But it looks like it's unfortunately going to be mostly this virtual, relying on other organizations throughout the year, which has really helped us build partnerships as well. Gonzalo, do you have stuff to add?
I can just add to that very comprehensive answer a 10-second point, which is that even in just the 12 years that I've followed this particular topic, the recruitment world has totally transformed. So now, I mean, there used to be newspaper ads in Puerto Rico to get people to go to Syracuse, you know, that's how people were finding dairy jobs. Not anymore. There are Facebook groups, private Facebook groups, where a recruiter will post one hint that they have a job in your state, and there will be 400 comments. It's incredible. That's your audience. And so when we talk about online, I know that's disappointing for groups that usually like to be face-to-face, but the online of this year is not what it used to be. And if you get our team in Texas, for example, does live events, Facebook Lives, and you get engagement, you get people sharing. So you might be able to reach a huge audience of your target audience if you get smart about using that.
That's a great note. Unfortunately, one that we have to end on because we're at time. So let me just thank our panelists again. Stephanie and Gonzalo, thanks for sharing a lot of your expertise with us today. Thanks to all of our attendees. I posted a few upcoming framework events in the chat for you to sign up on our website, www.frameworkta.org. And thank you again, and we hope to see you next time. Enjoy your day, everybody.
Thanks so much.